On March 17, 1943, within a hushed, wood-paneled study in Berlin, a German admiral received a document that defied all comprehension. It was a solitary page, a distillation of raw intelligence, yet its implications carried more destructive force than a bomb weighing 1,000 pounds. The report did not detail a novel superweapon or a clandestine military contingent. Instead, it chronicled a factory, an American industrial complex situated across an ocean, which was projected to soon possess the capacity to churn out a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the high command of Germany, this was an absurdity, a piece of American propaganda so outlandish it verged on the comical. However, for the covert operatives who risked their lives to procure this intelligence, it signified something far more profound. It was a death warrant etched in figures, the moment they knew with a chilling certainty that their cause was lost. This is the account of a stark reality too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to accept, and how the rejection of a single datum sealed the doom of the Third Reich. Within the very core of the Nazi war apparatus, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stood as an anomaly. As the chief of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency, he was a man whose existence was intertwined with unyielding hard facts. In contrast to the zealous ideologues populating Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was a practitioner of the old school, a seasoned naval officer, a patriot from a bygone era who perceived the world not through the distorted lens of ideology, but through the clear prism of strategic practicality. His allegiance was to Germany, and his sworn duty was to present the unvarnished truth, irrespective of its unpleasantness. His organization, the Abwehr, was an expansive network of agents and analysts spanning the globe, serving as the eyes and ears of the German military. In the initial phases of the war, the Abwehr had been instrumental in Germany's swift blitzkrieg victories, supplying the intelligence that enabled the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver its adversaries. Yet, by early 1943, the atmosphere in Berlin began to shift. The conflict was no longer characterized by triumphant parades. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had delivered a severe shock. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was relentlessly advancing with formidable power. In North Africa, American and British forces were steadily dismantling Rommel's celebrated Afrika Korps. The tide was demonstrably turning. Nevertheless, at the very pinnacle of command, a perilous sense of invincibility persisted. Hitler, isolated in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, grew increasingly detached from the world's realities, surrounded by sycophants who shielded him from adverse news and nurtured his delusions. He was convinced that the German war effort was solely a matter of sheer willpower. He believed the German soldier was inherently superior, German science was invincible, and victory was their predestined fate. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was poised to introduce a chilling dose of reality. He grasped the grim mathematics of warfare, understanding that modern conflict was not merely a confrontation of armies, but a clash of economies, a brutal calculus involving steel, oil, and aluminum. From his vantage point at the nexus of a global intelligence network, he began to discern figures that instilled profound fear. Figures that suggested Germany was not only losing the industrial war, but was on the precipice of being overwhelmed by an industrial juggernaut it could scarcely conceive. The intelligence did not arrive in a single blinding revelation. It was a slow, insidious dread, pieced together from a multitude of disparate sources. It began as subtle rumors overheard by German agents in neutral territories. A businessman returning from the United States spoke of a facility so immense it possessed its own microclimate. A diplomat stationed in Washington reported production quotas that seemed to include an superfluous digit. A Swedish engineer transmitted a coded dispatch concerning an aircraft assembly line operating with the efficiency of automobile manufacturing. Individually, these snippets could be dismissed. But as the reports converged at Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts identified a terrifying congruence. They all narrated the same account. They all pointed to a single location, a colossal industrial complex in Michigan known as Willow Run, and they all propagated the same unbelievable assertion. The Ford Motor Company was adapting automotive mass production techniques to the assembly of the four-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. Their objective was to eventually produce one unit every single hour. To the German mindset, this was utterly inconceivable. A B-24 Liberator was a formidable aircraft, an 18-ton behemoth constructed from aluminum and steel, comprising over 1.5 million individual components. German factories, renowned for their engineering prowess, required weeks, sometimes months, to construct a comparable heavy bomber such as the Heinkel HE-177. The notion that the Americans, a nation derided in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, racially mixed society, could assemble such a complex weapon in 60 minutes was not merely unbelievable, it was an affront. Canaris and his officers meticulously calculated the implications. If the Americans could indeed achieve this feat, one bomber per hour translated to 24 bombers daily, exceeding 700 per month from a solitary facility. At that juncture, the entire German aviation industry was struggling to achieve a mere fraction of this output in heavy bombers. The intelligence agents corroborated the specific details. The information underwent rigorous verification. Even Japanese naval attachés, allies of Germany, were transmitting reports on American production figures imbued with a palpable sense of dread. The data was irrefutable. But how could this be possible? How could a workforce composed of individuals the Nazis considered inferior, women, African Americans, immigrants, achieve such a remarkable feat? How could a fragmented democracy mobilize with such terrifying focus? Within the Nazi worldview, strength derived from racial purity and authoritarian control. America possessed neither. Consequently, the reports were presumed to be a fabrication, an elaborate deception. The alternative was too horrific to contemplate. It implied that the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or commanders, but a conflict of industrial might. And if this report from March 1943 presaged a tangible future, it meant Germany had already been vanquished. As one Abwehr officer aptly put it, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower, it is a question of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was steadily transforming into a concrete reality. Across a tract of farmland in Michigan, a colossus had arisen. It was the Willow Run bomber plant, the tangible manifestation of what President Roosevelt termed the arsenal of democracy. And nothing on earth bore its likeness. Conceived by the industrial architect Albert Kahn, the primary structure was a singular expanse so vast it was dubbed the most enormous room in human history. It stretched for more than half a mile. To circumvent taxation in two distinct counties, the assembly line famously incorporated a peculiar 90-degree turn, with partially constructed bombers rotating on immense turntables, a feature that became colloquially known as the tax turn. However, the true revolution resided within its operational philosophy. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made a bold, almost audacious commitment. They would manufacture airplanes in the same manner they produced Model T automobiles. The established aviation industry scoffed. "You cannot expect a blacksmith to craft a watch overnight," one executive derisively remarked. Ford and Sorensen proceeded to prove them wrong. They meticulously deconstructed the B-24 into manageable subassemblies. Each worker was trained for a single, repetitive task. One individual would drill holes, while another would rivet a panel repeatedly. This methodology allowed the plant's apprenticeship program to generate thousands of new workers weekly. And who constituted this workforce? They represented a direct contradiction to Nazi ideology. At its zenith, Willow Run employed over 42,000 individuals. Nearly one-third were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who expertly operated rivet guns and welding torches. One of these women, Rose Will Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the famous propaganda character. The workforce was a vibrant tapestry of American society. Over 9% of the workers were African American, and an additional 3% were classified as disabled, all collaborating side by side. They worked in shifts, 6 days a week, their collective effort generating a relentless 24-hour hum. This was the very mongrel society Hitler so frequently ridiculed. And they were on the verge of outproducing the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The initial stages were fraught with challenges, earning the plant the moniker Will It Run. Yet, as 1943 progressed, the machinery achieved optimal performance. Raw materials flowed in from one end, and exiting the other was an 18-ton heavy bomber ready for flight. This was not propaganda. It was a novel form of warfare, an assertion of industrial might. And America was deploying a weapon for which the Third Reich possessed no countermeasure. While German scientists focused on futuristic rockets, America was perfecting its most potent weapon, the assembly line. Armed with this disquieting truth, Admiral Canaris confronted his most formidable challenge, penetrating the ideological bulwark surrounding Adolf Hitler. This was a barrier constructed of arrogance and willful ignorance, and its principal architect was the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was a flamboyant World War I ace who perceived himself as the ultimate authority on aerial warfare. He was also profoundly corrupt and possessed an immense ego. More than anyone, Göring was responsible for fostering the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings regarding Willow Run, Göring's response was not one of concern but of derision. The reports were summarily dismissed. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously scoffed. "They are very adept at manufacturing refrigerators and razor blades." This was not merely a casual remark. It encapsulated the very essence of the Nazi worldview. In their estimation, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society. They were a mongrel race devoid of the discipline and martial spirit inherent to the German people. The very idea that such a culture could mass-produce a heavy bomber was, in Göring's estimation, simply preposterous. He dismissed the reports as clumsy American disinformation. One can only imagine the frustration Canaris experienced presenting mathematical certainty to a man entrenched in fantasy. He persisted, his agents providing specific details. The mile-long assembly line, the specialized tooling, the sheer magnitude of the capital investment. Göring refused to engage. He and his inner circle adhered to their own narrative, a dogma that admitted no questioning. To challenge it was not merely to dispute a military assessment. It was an act of heresy. Furthermore, for Göring to acknowledge Canaris's report would necessitate a devastating admission of failure. It would imply that his own intelligence apparatus had overlooked the most critical development of the war, and that his Luftwaffe was destined to be swept from the skies. Consequently, the report vanished. It was interred beneath Göring's colossal ego. The edifice of denial remained unbreached. Canaris was left with a truth that held the potential to salvage Germany, yet found no receptive ears in positions of power. The next logical step was the ultimate one: somehow convey the information to the sole individual who truly mattered, the Führer himself. Presenting facts within the Führer's headquarters was a peculiar and perilous undertaking. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and permeated with paranoia. Reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategic discourse and more about reinforcing the Führer's preconceived notions. Into this theater of delusion, the intelligence from Willow Run constituted a ticking time bomb. Hitler's perception of the United States was a strange amalgam of contempt for its culture and a grudging acknowledgement of its sheer size. He viewed it as a mongrel nation crippled by racial impurity and manipulated by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, the projections of 1 bomber per hour, over 650 per month from a single facility, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but was laced with unadulterated venom. This was not merely a matter of strategy, it was a personal affront to his ideology. The numbers were perceived as inflated fantasies, a form of Jewish propaganda. His own Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, a man who possessed a genuine understanding of production, would later admit during Allied interrogations that he knew if the Willow Run figures were even half accurate, Germany was irrevocably doomed. However, to voice such an assessment in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been tantamount to suicide. Thus, the momentous confrontation never truly materialized. It was a collision between irrefutable fact and unwavering dogma, and in the Third Reich, dogma invariably triumphed. The Admiral's warning was not merely disregarded, it was interpreted as a manifestation of defeatism. The individuals who delivered the truth were now viewed as weak, their patriotism called into question. In Hitler's mindset, the war was a contest of will and blood, not of logistical capabilities. A single document representing the perilous endeavors of dozens of intelligence operatives was summarily dismissed. It contained the most crucial strategic insight of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was expanding at a rate Germany could never hope to match. The decision was not articulated through an order, but through a stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. The truth was rejected. The spies were discredited. The admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the destinies of millions were irrevocably sealed. The repercussions of that denial were inevitable. They manifested first as a distant murmur, then escalated into a terrifying roar that enveloped the skies above the Reich. Believing their own inflated rhetoric, the German High Command embarked upon a series of catastrophic missteps. They continued to allocate vital resources to Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, while technologically advanced, held negligible strategic significance. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented a revolutionary leap, but it arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. They lacked the necessary time because the prophecy of Willow Run was inexorably unfolding. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers evolved into a veritable flood. The United States 8th Air Force initiated its relentless daylight bombing offensive, and at the vanguard of this campaign were the B-24 Liberators. The aircraft rolling off the assembly lines in Michigan were now darkening the German skies. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out offensive targeting the German aviation industry. Thousands of bombers, a significant proportion originating from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend its homeland and was systematically annihilated. German pilots, however valiant, were simply overwhelmed. For every German fighter that succumbed, only a meager number of replacements were available. For every American aircraft lost, 10 more were en route across the Atlantic. It was a brutal war of attrition, precisely as Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had assured would remain untouched by bombing were being reduced to ruins. A Luftwaffe general, utterly disillusioned by Göring's detachment from reality, recorded in his diary, "The Reichsmarshal lives in a fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers devastated Linz. He still insists they could not have produced so many aircraft. The B-24s emerging from the most colossal room in history were now systematically dismantling the Third Reich piece by piece. They shattered industrial facilities, ravaged railway networks, and obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to grind to a halt. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory whose leaders had initially derided it. So, what became of the man who attempted to sound the alarm?" For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the consequence of uttering the truth was severe. As the war increasingly turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as an individual not to be trusted. Within Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist was often misconstrued as being a traitor. His rivals within the SS viewed the Abwehr as a hotbed of untrustworthy old-world aristocrats who lacked genuine Nazi fervor. They kept him under surveillance, awaiting any misstep. His accurate reports concerning American industry were not merely dismissed, they were interpreted as evidence that Canaris himself was disseminating enemy propaganda. He found himself ensnared. To perform his duties was to appear disloyal. However, Canaris's opposition extended beyond mere intelligence assessments. Horrified by the atrocities perpetrated by the SS, he utilized the Abwehr to discreetly protect members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He also secretly worked to prevent Spain from aligning with the Axis powers, an act of sabotage that inflicted significant damage upon Hitler's strategic objectives. The final blow came in the aftermath of the failed July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. The subsequent Gestapo investigation uncovered an extensive network of opposition, with numerous threads leading back to the Abwehr. Canaris was apprehended. His personal journals were discovered, revealing the profound depth of his dissent against the regime. On April 9, 1945, in the final, chaotic weeks of the war, a vengeful Hitler issued the order. At the Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped of his attire, was slowly strangled to death with piano wire. It was a brutal, humiliating demise for the man who had possessed such clear foresight. He was murdered by the very regime he had endeavored to save from its own inherent blindness. He delivered the crucial message, and for his efforts, he was systematically erased. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final figures unequivocally demonstrated the accuracy of Canaris's foresight. The report that had landed on his desk in 1943 was not merely accurate, it was an understatement. The ultimate production figures for Willow Run were staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last aircraft rolled off the production line, Ford had manufactured 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run, and an additional 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Consider this. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed to produce throughout the entirety of the war. The disparity was not even marginal. Across all its manufacturing facilities, the United States produced over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, establishing it as the most prolifically produced heavy bomber in history. From 1940 to 1945, the U.S. manufactured a total of over 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, during the same period, produced approximately 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Knudsen aptly summarized the situation. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. The German failure to accept this reality was not a failure of espionage. German agents had executed their mission flawlessly. They had procured the intelligence. The failure was one of acceptance, a complete cognitive collapse at the highest echelons of leadership. It was an inability to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, ensnared by their own propaganda, simply could not reconcile the figures with their predetermined beliefs. They were defeated not by a clandestine weapon, but by elementary arithmetic. They were overwhelmed by an avalanche of steel and aluminum, forged by the very individuals they scorned. Men and women from diverse backgrounds, united in a free society. The spies had been correct. The Admiral had been correct. March 17, 1943, marked the arrival of truth in Berlin, and no one in a position of authority was willing to heed its message. Narratives such as this underscore how history is often shaped by moments far removed from the battlefield, occurring in quiet offices where a single document can alter the course of everything. If you find joy in uncovering the hidden stories that determined history's trajectory, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and activate the notification bell to avoid missing our subsequent investigations. Your engagement through likes and shares with others who appreciate compelling narratives significantly aids our endeavors. Ultimately, the story of Willow Run transcends a mere intriguing World War II anecdote. It offers a sobering glimpse into how any government, any group, or even any individual can be blinded by their desires and preconceptions. The Third Reich was not vanquished due to a lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders deliberately chose to prioritize their prejudices over verifiable facts. They constructed a worldview upon the shifting sands of racial mythology. And when the inexorable tide of mathematical reality surged forth, their entire edifice crumbled. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim pronouncements and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Göring represented a battle for the very soul of the German war effort, a contest between empirical evidence and utter fantasy. Fantasy prevailed, and in doing so, doomed the entire undertaking. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a testament to the very principles Nazism sought to eradicate: the potent capacity of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never replicate. The industrial setting served as a miniature reflection of the unified nation's endeavor. It was an unorganized, less than optimal, yet remarkably compelling panorama of people, whose combined efforts brought about great success. Consequently, the enduring impact of that particular day in March of 1943 resonates across the ages. This serves as a clear and potent illustration that the most insurmountable barriers are not constructed from physical materials like bricks and stone, but are rather the internal constructs we erect within our own thoughts.